In this video, we're going to talk about how Native Americans survived relentless downpours that would break most modern campers. Forget your Gore-Tex jackets and waterproof tents. These indigenous peoples had no synthetic materials, yet they stayed completely dry for days in conditions that seem impossible. They turned animal brains into high-tech fabric, designed cone-shaped homes that used physics itself as protection, and created waterproof materials from intestines that rival modern membranes. By the end of this video, you'll realize that everything you thought you knew about survival in the rain is actually wrong, and these ancient techniques still outperform much of today's expensive gear. How Native Americans stayed dry in endless hard rain. The secret of brain-tanned leather. When we think of Native American clothing, we picture leather, but not the stiff, tanned leather we know today. The real secret was a material called buckskin, produced through an extraordinary process called brain tanning. This wasn't your typical leather treatment. Indigenous peoples took hides from deer, elk, or bison and treated them with an emulsion made from the animal's own brain. Yes, you heard that right. Brains were the key ingredient. This process loosened the fibers, creating material that was incredibly soft, elastic, and breathable. But brain-tanned leather had one critical flaw. When it got wet, it would dry as stiff as cardboard. To solve this problem, they applied a second decisive step that changed everything: smoking. The hides were stretched over frames and suspended over thick, smoldering fires of specific wood types for hours or even days. The smoke penetrated every fiber, coating it with resin particles. The formaldehyde contained in the smoke stabilized the protein bonds, preventing them from sticking together as they dried. The result was revolutionary. A material that remained completely soft and elastic, no matter how many times it got wet and dried out. This smoked leather acquired a beautiful golden brown hue and characteristic smoky smell. But most importantly, it created what we would call high-tech fabric today. Shirts, leggings, dresses, and moccasins made from this material weren't waterproof in the modern sense. They were something better. They were quick-drying and moisture-resistant, allowing the body to breathe while preventing dangerous sweat accumulation in cold weather. This fundamental difference in philosophy, not fighting water but adapting to it, was their first secret to survival. Indigenous peoples understood that absolute dryness was unattainable, but quick drying was vital. Their clothing could get soaked in heavy downpours, but dried incredibly fast from body heat or by a fire without losing its properties. It was a philosophy embodied in the material itself. The engineering marvel of the Tipi. For the tribes of the Great Plains like the Lakota and Cheyenne, the Tipi wasn't just a tent, it was an engineering masterpiece refined over centuries. Its genius began with the perfect conical shape, the most aerodynamic form imaginable. Strong winds simply flowed around the teepee, finding no surface to exert pressure on. This same shape was ideal for rain. Water hitting the steep slope had no chance of lingering or seeping inside. It immediately rolled down to the ground. Unlike flat-roof tents where water collects and seeks out cracks, the conical shape used gravity itself as its main ally. The frame consisted of long, straight poles, usually made of young lodgepole pine. These poles were light, strong, and straight, set up in a special system forming a stable tripod or quadrupod base. The covering was sewn from a dozen or more specially treated bison hides. This required tremendous skill. All pieces had to fit together perfectly, forming a single semicircle wrapped around the frame. The waterproofing secret lay in the details. The hides were sewn together using sinew, which had a unique property. When wet, it swelled slightly. At the very beginning of rain, when the first drops fell on the seams, the sinew threads expanded and tightly sealed the needle holes. This was essentially a smart, self-sealing roof. The heavier the rain, the tighter and more airtight the seams became. The entrance always faced east, away from prevailing westerly winds and storms. It was closed with a separate flap that reliably protected the interior from slanting rain and drafts. But this was only the outer shell. The real secret lay inside. The hidden inner lining. The ozan. Most people think the inside of a teepee was just bare poles and an outer covering, but that's completely wrong. The dwelling had a second inner wall made of lighter, beautifully painted skins that the Lakota called the ozan. This wasn't mere decoration. It was a key element of the climate control and waterproofing system. The ozan didn't reach all the way to the top, but attached to the poles at about human height, creating an air gap around the entire perimeter. This air gap worked like modern double glazing. In winter, it helped retain heat from the hearth. In summer, it prevented hot sun from heating the interior. But its most ingenious function revealed itself during rain. The ozan protected people from drafts, while cold air that penetrated from below entered the gap, was heated by the hearth, and rushed upward, creating ideal smoke circulation. Even the best hide covering could eventually leak moisture, especially where poles touched it. Condensation could form on the inside of rain-cooled skin. Here's where the ozan became an ingenious water collector. Any drops from leaks or condensation fell not on people's heads, but on the outside of the ozan. Since the lining was stretched at an angle, water simply rolled down it. The ozan ended at a certain height above ground, so water rolling down it fell to the ground outside the living area at the very edge of the dwelling. It was brilliant passive engineering. No moving parts, no maintenance, just physics working perfectly. The Longhouse. Bark architecture. Moving from the Great Plains to the northeast, we find the Iroquois Confederacy, where the climate was even more humid with frequent prolonged rains. Here, the architectural response was completely different. The Longhouse. These massive structures were the apartment buildings of their time, tens of meters long, housing many families of the same clan. The key material was elm bark. In spring, when sap flowed actively, bark separated from the trunk in large, flexible sheets. These sheets were pressed and dried to make them flat and strong like plywood. The bark sheets were laid overlapping on an arched frame, like tiles. This overlapping method was the main waterproofing secret. The Iroquois used 2 layers of bark. The inner layer laid horizontally, the outer layer vertically. This created a strong, watertight structure. Each upper sheet overlapped the lower one, so water had no way to get inside. Gravity worked in the builder's favor once again. The roof was arched or dabled, ensuring quick, efficient drainage. If one bark sheet leaked, it could be easily replaced without dismantling the entire roof. To seal joints and small cracks, they used natural resin mixed with charcoal, an elastic, completely waterproof mastic. Smoke vents stretched along the entire roof ridge, located above each family hearth. During rain, movable bark panels were slid to leave only a small gap, enough for smoke to escape, but too narrow for precipitation to enter. It was simple, effective climate control. Birch bark, nature's perfect membrane. Birch bark deserves special attention. This natural material contains a wax-like substance called betulin, which not only repels water, but protects the material from rotting. It was nature's membrane created long before synthetic analogs. The process of obtaining bark was ritualistic. Indigenous peoples never took bark from young or weak trees, understanding it would harm the forest. The ideal donor was a mature birch growing in the right place. The bark was removed in large strips, carefully avoiding damage to inner layers so the tree could recover. It wasn't just resource extraction, it was cooperation with nature. These birch bark layers were used as shingles for wigwams and longhouse roofs, laid in several layers like fish scales, so water would roll off without finding gaps. The flexibility of birch bark allowed roofs of any shape to be created, and it was easy to repair by replacing damaged sections. It was modular, renewable building material. Beyond roofs, birch bark was crafted into completely waterproof containers. boxes, buckets, and baskets. The seams were carefully coated with boiling resin from coniferous trees, which when hardened created a completely watertight seal. These containers could protect food, tinder, medicinal herbs, and tools from any amount of rain. Waterproof clothing, cedar and intestines. On the rainy northwest coast, nature provided a unique material, red cedar bark. Peoples like the Tlingit and Haida learned to turn it into clothing that protected from water as effectively as skins. The inner layer of cedar bark consists of long, strong fibers that could be separated into the finest threads. These fibers were woven into capes, raincoats, and conical hats so densely that rainwater simply rolled off the surface without penetrating inside. The natural oils in cedar contributed to its waterproofing. The fibers were arranged vertically, creating natural drainage channels. The raincoat worked like a tiled roof where each element overlapped the one below. But perhaps the most remarkable waterproof material was one you'd never expect: processed animal intestines. The intestines and bladders of large animals like bison or elk were thoroughly cleaned and processed to produce very thin, translucent, completely waterproof material. This was the pinnacle of rational use. No part of the animal was wasted. The intestines were cut lengthwise, cleaned, and stretched on frames for drying, resulting in long, parchment-like strips. These were sewn together with finest tendons to create large sheets for lightweight waterproof capes and bags. Such a cape was barely noticeable on the body, but provided complete protection from even the heaviest downpour. After use, it rolled into a tiny ball, the equivalent of modern ultralight membrane jackets. Some Northwest people sewed entire waterproof suits from processed intestines of marine mammals. In such suits, hunters and kayaks could stay dry even in stormy seas. It was vital technology, and the uniqueness lay in the material's structure of collagen and elastin, tear-resistant and unchanging when wet. It was a natural polymer perfected by evolution. Fat impregnation, natural waterproofing. The best rain clothing wasn't just well sewn, it was properly prepared. Indigenous peoples discovered that treating leather and buckskin with animal fats turned them into excellent water-repellent materials. The main ingredient was fat from large animals like bears, bison, or moose. This fat was carefully rendered, purified, and turned into pure, thick oil. The impregnation process was simple but required patience. Leather clothing was thoroughly and evenly rubbed with warm fat, which was absorbed deep into the material's pores. After applying fat, the clothing was often smoked over a fire. The smoke polymerized the fats, making the coating more resistant and durable. This treatment made leather not only waterproof but also softer and more elastic. It didn't stiffen in cold or crack over time. The fat created a very thin film on the surface, causing water droplets to roll off without absorption, similar to modern wax impregnations, but completely natural. Beyond fat, other substances were used: beaver castoreum or bone marrow. Each people had secret recipes that improved the impregnation properties. This knowledge was worth its weight in gold. Smart footwear strategy. Keeping feet dry was one of the most difficult challenges. Indigenous people solved this with layering and proper treatment. Moccasins were thoroughly impregnated with fat and smoked, but the main trick was the inner filling. A thick layer of dry material, usually grass or moss, was placed inside, serving as both insulation and absorbent. This inner layer worked like a sponge, absorbing any moisture that penetrated through seams, while feet remained in contact with dry material. Such insoles were disposable. After a long journey through wet terrain, the wet grass was simply thrown away and replaced with fresh, dry material. This system allowed shoes to dry quickly from the inside without needing a large fire. It was enough to simply replace the wet filling. In some regions, waterproof shoe covers were worn over regular moccasins, creating an additional barrier. High gaiters or leather wraps prevented water from flowing into moccasins from above when walking on wet grass. Reading the landscape. Before any shelter was built, choosing the right location was critical. No experienced person would ever build in a low-lying area or dry creek bed. They knew these places would turn into torrents or deep puddles during heavy rains. The ability to read terrain was a vital skill. A small hill with gentle slopes was ideal, ensuring natural drainage from all sides. The dwelling remained on a dry island even when everything around flooded. The direction of prevailing winds was also considered. The entrance was placed on the leeward side so slanting rain wouldn't blow inside. The type of soil mattered enormously. Sandy soil absorbs water well, preventing puddles. Clay soil quickly saturates and water accumulates on the surface. Indigenous peoples paid attention to nature's behavior, where puddles remained longest after rain, where ground dried fastest. These observations allowed them to accurately identify safe areas. Drainage systems. When terrain wasn't ideal, drainage technology came into play. A shallow ditch was always dug around dwellings, whether teepee or longhouse. This small ditch became an insurmountable barrier to water flow. Water flowing toward the shelter fell into the ditch and flowed along it, bypassing the dwelling. The depth and width depended on soil type and terrain slope. The ditch was always dug with slight slope toward natural low points, ensuring water drained constantly rather than stagnating. Earth removed from digging was often placed along the inner edge, creating a small embankment as additional barrier. For long-term settlements like Iroquois villages, the drainage system was integral to layout. Ditches drained water not only from individual houses but from entire streets, preventing villages from turning into muddy swamps after every rainfall. Fire management in the rain. Staying dry outside is only part of the battle. It was equally important to quickly start fires to warm up and dry clothes. The secret was always carrying dry kindling in waterproof packaging. Bags made of fat-treated leather or birch bark containers, storing dry moss, crushed bark, or wood dust. But the most valuable thing was portable fire. Smoldering coals from fires could be preserved for hours or even days in special containers where they continued to smolder slowly without oxygen access. Tinder fungi, mushrooms growing on trees, were often used. The dried core could smolder for a very long time, like a cigar, carried along and used to start fires at new campsites. Finding dry firewood in wet forests was also an art. Indigenous peoples knew that dead lower branches of coniferous trees remain dry even in heavy rain, protected by the dense crown. They also looked for dead wood standing upright. Water runs down such trunks, but the core remains dry. A special technique was used to build fires in rain. First, a small shelter for the fire was built from stones or wet logs. Inside, on a base of branches, a small fire was lit using the best kindling. Gradually, larger pieces were added, allowing them to dry before catching fire. Step by step, it was possible to build a large fire even on wet ground. The philosophy of adaptation. Everything we've discussed, from smoked leather to drainage ditches, adds up to a single coherent philosophy. Indigenous peoples of North America didn't try to defeat the rain. They didn't seek to create a sterile, completely dry capsule around themselves as modern humans do. They understood that rain is as much a part of the world as sun or wind. It's impossible to fight it. You can only coexist with it. Their entire survival strategy was based on adaptation, not resistance. They accepted that you get wet when it rains, so their clothing was designed to dry quickly without losing properties. Their shoes got wet but remained soft and comfortable, with replaceable grass insoles solving heat and moisture problems. They knew water would flow, so their dwellings were designed not to resist it, but to direct it. The cone of the teepee and bark tiles used gravity to divert flow. The inner ozan and drainage ditches managed moisture that did get inside. This way of thinking allowed them not only to survive, but to live comfortably in conditions that seem extreme to us. Rain wasn't a disaster but simply weather. It caused inconvenience but not threat, because they always had ready, proven responses. The secrets of Native American survival in rain weren't isolated tricks. but a comprehensive, deeply thought-out system. It covered everything from chemical treatment of materials like smoking leather to ingenious engineering solutions like the double air construction of the teepee and strategic thinking when choosing campsites. It was a holistic approach that worked with nature rather than against it. And that's a lesson we could all learn from today.